All right, thank you. So our final presentation is our keynote, and we're glad to have him here, and with a strong reputation. Josh Goldstein is the director of the Bridge Collaborative, and it's an initiative out of the Nature Conservancy. And please join me in welcoming Josh.
Well, good afternoon. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me to speak. As a resident of Northern Colorado, it's truly incredibly inspiring to see how many people are here today. We're all here because we care very much about a future where we have a healthy, working Poudre River. And I'm here today in my two professional hats. The first is as a scientist at the Nature Conservancy, where I support the global work that we do. And then the second is as the director of the Bridge Collaborative. We're a partnership that is working to accelerate solutions that can benefit the environment, human health, and economic development all together. And my talk is coming, obviously, at the end of a long, action-packed day already. And so I want to focus on three things in this talk. The first is to share some stories from outside of Colorado, where collaborative efforts are doing the hard work, much like here, to try to find positive futures for rivers around the world. The second is pulling from those stories to pull out some ingredients that I think can be particularly helpful for fostering quality collaborations for rivers. And then third, thinking about those stories, thinking about those ingredients, motivate some questions for reflection. Things that perhaps each of us could be thinking a bit about as we enter into collaboratives, to be thinking, are we showing up in a way that's doing the best we can to make this collaborative successful? And so I am going to take us on a bit of a field trip far away from the Poudre. I think you'll find that the stories resonate well with the challenges and the opportunities that we're seeing here and that we've talked about today. So I'm going to start my talk with a bit of a story, and it's a bit of a humbling one, where I learned one of my first and most important lessons about collaboration some years ago. So back in 2004, I was a graduate student in conservation science, and I was with a team that was exploring a new project on the Big Island of Hawaii. And our work generally focused on working with ranchers and other landowners to look at ways to adopt conservation practices in economically beneficial ways for those ranchers. And on this particular day, we had a chance to go out on the ranch with the folks shown here, Jimmy and Emmy, and a longtime ranching family on the west side of the Big Island. And we had a chance to meet them for the first time, tour the ranch, talk story a bit, and learn a lot about the history, the management, the challenges facing this ranch and going into the future. And we spent the day, a very productive day. Partway through, Jimmy said, I want to hear much more about what you guys are thinking. How can we work together? We started talking about it. The ball was passed to me. I started talking about my interest in looking at economic models and business models for the ranch that could drive native tree restoration that was profitable for the rancher and also could help restore habitat for native plants and birds. And in essence, restore ecological value to some of the degraded lands on that ranch. So degraded. I will never hear that word again and not be brought back to this exact moment in time. So Jimmy responded. He was a tall but soft-spoken person, and he said, these are some really interesting ideas, and I think we've got a lot to talk about. I don't see my land as, quote, degraded. And I swear my heart stopped in that moment as a young grad student. And this word that we had used almost casually in the conservation science community to refer to lands that were of lower biodiversity value, a okay technical definition, came across in a way that I didn't even realize, in a way that was not constructive to opening up dialogue with Jimmy and Emily and their family. And I am so grateful that conversation that day could have stopped there. And Jimmy reacted in the best way possible. He said, we've got a lot to talk about. We've got some work to do on language. We've got some work to do to understand each other. But let's keep talking. I think we've got a lot that we can do. And that day turned into many years of great partnership that we had doing work together towards this future that we both thought was helpful. And I learned an important lesson about empathy and curiosity that day, about how important those are as the foundation of good collaboration. And I appreciate so much how Jimmy taught me that lesson. And as I think about the challenges we face, I think one of the biggest ones is that we are not in conversation in a good way with enough of the people we need to be to solve the challenges that are in front of us. There's a great quote by the famous actress Lily Tomlin, and she said, "We are all in this together by ourselves." And so I think that first part is undoubtedly true. We live in a complex, messy world, and we are all in this together. But the second part we can change. We don't need to be by ourselves. We can find more effective ways to work together to open up space to achieve more of the goals that we set out to achieve. And so I think, and what I'll say, is that in essence, our goal is to prove Lily Tomlin wrong. To not just be in this together, but to be able to actually work together to solve the challenges we face. Because we are not going to get there on our own. So if we think about the future, by mid-century, we are going to have 9 and likely closer to 10 billion people on this planet. Rivers which today are already working hard are going to be asked to work even harder going forward. An estimated 70% of the infrastructure that will be on this planet by 2050 does not even yet exist on the planet. These numbers are just mind-boggling. And so whether we're focused on the Poudre River or another system, or we're focused on driving action globally, we really can't be doing this work on our own. And there are many ingredients that go into successful collaborations, many more than I'll be able to touch on in the talk today. What I want to do is draw on my experience as a scientist, because I'm often brought into collaborative efforts to help conduct analyses that help stakeholders better understand the problems that they're facing and look at ways that they can solve them to deliver greater shared value that they're looking for. And so in that context, I want to share thoughts today on 3 ingredients that can help foster quality collaborations. The first is around defining what might be considered the right shared problem that needs to be solved, that is inclusive, coming from a place of empathy and the evidence about what's going on in that place. The second then is, once we have spent some good time on the problem, setting a North Star. How do we set what success looks like, and then start measuring progress to know, are we getting closer or farther from where we're trying to go? And then the final one is about pursuing unexpected collaborations. That sometimes the information, the expertise we need isn't the people we're talking to, and it's far afield from the people we think we should be talking to. And actually that can unlock some opportunity that we wouldn't have otherwise had to advance our work. So let me dig into the first part of the talk here on defining the shared problem. And I'll bring another quote in from Albert Einstein, and he said, quote, "If I had 1 hour to save the planet, I would spend 59 minutes of that defining the problem and 1 minute resolving it." So I would say that that's a bit extreme. I'm not sure we need 59 minutes, but we probably need to spend a lot of time. And there's a nugget of wisdom in there that if we aren't focused on the right problem to solve, the actions we're taking are probably not going to get us to where we want to go. And so it's in that context that I want to sort of think about how we create a more inclusive definition of the problem. Again, grounded in empathy for those we're working with, and also thinking about the evidence of what the problems are that are in front of us. And to do this, I want to share some of my experiences working with a broad team of folks in the country of Gabon. This is a country that's in the larger Congo Forest River Basin. It's in West Central Africa. It's actually a country that's about the size of Colorado, but with roughly half the inhabitants. This is a country that's on a really incredible trajectory right now. A major economic transition is underway, and a major development boom is happening. For decades, Gabon's economy has been driven by offshore oil extraction, and as those reserves get increasingly difficult to access, the country is looking into its interior and trying to build out its agriculture, its forestry, its extractives, tourism, and other industries that can create a more diversified economy. And this is a country that is truly rich in natural treasures. It has lush forests, wild rivers. There are actually fish species that just a couple years ago were recorded for the first time ever in history. And there's iconic wildlife. There are elephants, there are gorillas, there are mandrills, and there are the famous surfing hippos. Hippos that live on the coast and literally surf the waves into the beach. It is an amazing place. And as we think about the future of this country, they have committed to a smart growth trajectory, what we might call a green economic development path, trying to develop its economy in ways that acknowledges and celebrates the rich natural treasures that it already has and keep those in good condition. It is easy to say, it is easy to say and it is very hard to do. And so how these decisions play out and how Gabon grows will be a huge difference in terms of whether the country supports its people and nature or not going forward. Rivers are very much the lifeblood of Gabon for its urban and rural residents. One of these rivers, one of its hardest working rivers, is the Mbe River. This river supports hydropower production that provides energy to 60% of Gabon's population. It's water supply for many of these residents, and it does a lot that is asked of this river at this current state. And I had a chance in 2015 to take a trip to Gabon, and I landed on a Friday night as with a team of folks who were in country and others coming with me from outside. And we were going to look at the Mbe watershed and other places to try and understand how we could be supportive of the green economy process underway. And I landed on a Friday night, and it turns out there was a blackout in the city when I landed. And I'd come to learn in the coming days that blackout was actually tied to what was happening in the Mbe watershed several hours away because of maintenance problems at the hydropower plants. And a good reminder that what happens in watersheds far away very much matters to the cities and the residents that are in them. And so on Friday night, I slept. I got up Saturday morning, and our group went out into the field to tour the Mbe watershed and get a good sense of what was going on across all the different types of activities in the watershed. We were we were taken out by the Ministry of Forest and Water, a group that thinks a lot about this watershed. And we spent our time touring that Saturday, and we saw lots of things around forestry, around mining, and so on, including the hydropower plants. And that day, the river was running clear as could be, as you can see in this river. The main stem, the tributaries, everything. That night, there was a really intense storm that came in the watershed. And when we woke up Sunday morning, the river looked very different. And the river, the main stem, had a high sediment load in it. And it was coming from, in part, these big erosion scars and dirt roads throughout the watershed. And just a small look into what was going on. But the tributaries, which had much more intact vegetation and didn't have erosion scars for them, was still running clean. And you can see that really great line of difference if it comes out in the photo between the clean and the more dirtied water. And this sort of is, for me, one of the most striking times I've ever had in the field of being able to literally see the problem we're working on in real time. We could walk out and have 1 foot in the clean and 1 foot in the dirty and see what was happening. And understanding how those processes, a small view into it, is connected to the hydropower challenges and the larger challenges that are happening in this Mbe River basin. And so hydropower is a part that we are particularly interested in, but it's one piece of a much larger story in this hard-working watershed. How do we sustain hydropower production? Yet there's also critical use of this watershed for water supply for rural and urban residents. There's forestry concessions that are throughout the area, mining concessions. There's a national park that has endemic species that are in this region found nowhere else on the planet. Many rural villages, while small in number, these communities are highly dependent on the river directly and take up small-scale agriculture. Many, many interests at play, yet what has been happening years ago was that these actors were trying to solve their problems on their own. Energy was an energy challenge, and water was a water challenge. And at the federal ministry level or other levels, they weren't having good lines of communication that actually could help understand how their actions were affected by or affecting others that they cared about. And that was a big part of understanding what the problem was and trying to drive towards a more inclusive definition across all these interests of what the problem was. And I just briefly put disease outbreaks in parentheses at the bottom. It's not an issue in the Mbe watershed, but the coronavirus and the increasingly intricate interactions between people and wildlife reminds us that we are going to need to be starting to broaden our definition of the problem to think about human health and infectious disease outbreaks in places like the Congo Basin that we have historically not been thinking about it before. And so as we finished our tour of the watershed and really thought about the hydropower operations, there's a need to really think about driving a collaborative process that could move from the hydropower producers thinking just about the issues they are working on directly to the broader watershed context and how they are connected to and how they affect all that is going on, moving from a narrower sector-focused definition to a more inclusive understanding of all that is at stake for the different groups at play in the watershed itself. One of the big challenges in Gabon for trying to drive this broader conversation was just really substantial lacks of basic data on the condition of freshwater systems. That is something that we, with partners, recognize and try to take some initial steps to create a spatial freshwater atlas on the current conditions of what's happening in the watershed, and being able to use that data across all these different value areas and use that to input into the national land use and river basin planning efforts that were underway in Gabon, again, towards a green economy. I'm going to pick up on the Gabon story in a second again, but I want to briefly divert for another anecdote on the need to keep asking ourselves what the right problem is to solve. So when we step back and think about the global pressures on rivers, there's a long list. I'll put just a few up in the context of people here. When we think about still the massive needs of billions of people around the world to get basic access to water, safe sanitation, people who are facing water scarcity, and there's still large volumes of wastewater discharge that are not safely treated. And similarly, many things that we are doing to alter rivers that are affecting their ecological health. What's on the left and right of this screen for people in nature are tightly connected, and we're going to need to recognize that going forward. At the Nature Conservancy, we've been looking at these global trends for the last couple of years and trying to ask ourselves, are we solving the right problems? And that created a small but important aha moment for us in our process. We focus in on the watershed context directly. Our work is mostly focused on the pollution side, on looking at nutrient and sediment runoff, two very important areas for sure. But as we expand into more and more geographies around the world, we're realizing that we are missing a key part of the pollution equation. And that pollution is coming from lack of sanitation and insufficient wastewater treatment. And that was outside of our mental model of what we needed to work on. And we're now in the process of scoping that into our problem statement, broadening our definition, and looking for the partners that do this work, that we can work in places like Africa and Latin America in particular to drive more effective problem definition and solutions to meet the pressures that are facing rivers around the world. So I want to wrap this first part of the talk by thinking a bit about this shared problem that we need to solve and provide suggestions of a couple of questions for reflection that we can, lenses we can use, perhaps simplistic, but I think useful in the complicated messiness of collaboration to be able to reflect on in our work. So the first is, have we taken sufficient time, thinking back to Albert Einstein's quote, to understand the shared risks we face, bringing both empathy to that conversation and evidence of what's going on. And towards that, have we valued input from all the relevant sources of evidence, all the kinds of knowledge out there to define the right problem? And then third, have we engaged the right partners in this work to make sure we don't have blind spots about what those key issues are, and to make sure we are doing that work we need to solve the right problem before we take action? I'll move on to the next part of the talk here. So if we've done the hard work to think about the problem, and it's certainly not linear, right? It happens, things change, we redefine. We want to move then to thinking a bit about what success looks like. It's not easy when there's so many values on the table. How do we, though, have that conversation about what success looks like, and then be clear on ways that we can set metrics to figure out, are we getting closer or are getting farther away from the goals that we have set for ourselves? We need some kind of North Star in our efforts to be able to provide that. So I want to go back to the context in Gabon and pick up on the hydropower story. What you're seeing here is a map with a bunch of triangles on it. And these triangles show in green the 3 dams and hydropower operations that exist in the country now. In red, the dams that are proposed and reasonably far along in their planning process. And then the many triangles in orange that are possible additional plants that may be built. There is a lot of possible futures for the rivers here in Gabon. And hydropower, of course, is only one of many issues that needs to be figured out. Not all of these dams need or will be built to provide energy for the country. So the question really is, what does success look like? How much energy are we looking for? How does that affect other values we care about? And which of these should we build? what should happen where and how to be able to meet the country's energy needs and do so in a way that supports that broader vision of a green economy. There have been challenges in Gabon for sure in the past of federal ministries and other actors working very deeply in their silos. And that question of what should happen would have been answered very much just by the Ministry of Energy. An important ministry, does great work. Those conversations would have happened there, decisions made, projects decided, and light consultation happening elsewhere. And what's exciting about what's happening in Gabon now is that it's a much broader set of stakeholders, in this case, primarily federal ministries and agencies that are directly in conversation to try and figure out what is the workable space across the things that I care about and the things that you care about for that we can start to drive better solutions going forward. You see all these agencies and ministries here listed of energy, of environment, national parks, fisheries, the National Public Investment Fund, the Planning Agency, and the National Climate Council. It's a pretty good list, not everything, but a pretty good list of what matters in these basins, and all starting to be in conversation more to drive solutions together. And what the way we engage with them and what they're interested in was support with a modeling effort to start to facilitate conversations about what are the values we have, how do we look at them in a modeling effort across the wide range of scenarios that are possible for where development could happen, and how do we do the best we can to achieve the future we want and be really crystal clear on what the trade-offs are. And so through this process, there was a lot of discussion about what the values were and what needed to be planned for, and then turning those values into specific metrics that could be modeled and looked at in a rigorous and structured way. And so you'll see a bunch of those on the slide here. They're not all of them, but things that make sense around energy production, river connectivity and flows, greenhouse gas emissions, how many people would be resettled as different areas are flooded and inundated for reservoirs, and others you see here and not listed. I'll also note that there's things that are not listed here because they couldn't be quantified. There's not the data on fisheries that are needed to be incorporated into this type of modeling effort. And that's tricky, right? Because you have some things that get quantified in a multi-value context, and you have some things that are outside of that, which really should be in there. And so you need to manage this in a way that both allows the modeling to move forward, but also keeps those other things that aren't able to be modeled really present and thoughtful in the conversation. This is the one really busy and messy slide I'm going to show, and I want to break it down in a really simple way, because it's actually a couple simple and powerful insights that come from this. So a model was set up and run, something like 200,000 model runs were done of various kinds of combinations. The computing power today is truly amazing in what you can do. And what you've got to do then is sort of tunnel through that sort of huge number of runs and generate some insights. So what you see here in the verticals is that each vertical line represents one of the metrics about something that one of the ministries cares about. So on the left, it's related to energy production. You move towards connectivity, around greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. So the verticals are the things we care about. And in essence, the top line is nirvana. So if we could get to that line, everyone gets everything that they want in this situation. So spoiler alert, there is nothing, and there is no model run that hits that top. Not surprising, right? The bottom, though, right, is the place we want to avoid, the space where we are not achieving our goals really for anyone. And that space in the middle is the fun and challenging place of looking at trade-offs. And so in this diagram, there's a lot of blue, but in essence, there's thousands of lines where each one is showing you a line across where it hits on the values, higher, better, lower, less good. And what's sort of interesting in these conversations, on the one hand, there's a strong focus on what hydropower plants should be developed. And there's a rough target of the kinds of megawatts to bring onto the system that are needed. Let's say it's roughly in this range of 200 to 400 that need to be planned for, what's shown in that left-hand circle there. Within that range of acceptable futures from the energy side alone, there is enormous variation in what you can do for other values at the table. And I'll just highlight one here on connectivity, that for a given level of acceptable energy production, you can basically reach the top for the best connectivity or almost down to the bottom of really destroying connectivity on the rivers at play. And so the insights from this, I think, are really useful. On the one hand, trade-offs are everywhere, and you can't have your cake and eat it. It's a very difficult space to be thinking about. There's that sort of dismal side to it. I think you can flip that around and really recognize that we can have conversations about what the acceptable ranges are across different values that we care about, and how do we best match those up to do the best we can for the future of the river basins that we care about. This tool is in a decision support system where the stakeholders are asking the kinds of what-if questions that they are interested in asking to be able to build more insight from the model results itself. And I think there's one interesting thing that happened in the discussions. There were a couple stakeholders, they just wanted the single answer. They said, let's throw away all this complexity. Like, what's the one right way to move forward? And I wish there was an easy way to do that, but in such a multi-stakeholder, multi-value process, that's really difficult. And so I think if you can move the conversation to what are the acceptable ranges, where I can live with the results, we can think a lot about that. And so this work is now moving into a situation where we are thinking about moving from a pilot scale into a broader national effort. And it's exciting that the Ministry of Energy wants to partner with the Ministry of Environment, two ministries that don't always work together in productive ways, to carry it forward in a more robust national way. So I'll wrap this section with, again, providing just a few questions for reflection about how we show up in collaboration to set a North Star for success. So are all the interests fairly represented in the shared goals and metrics? Do we have a structured way to look at synergies and trade-offs across all these metrics? And in exploring solutions, are there flexibilities with what happens where that can help us achieve more and not unduly harm others that are part of the process? So let's know what our North Star is and be extremely flexible with how to get there. So I want to now turn to the final chapter in the story that I want to tell today. And for this one, it's focused on pursuing unexpected collaborations and how sometimes reaching outside of our comfort zone or the mental model of who is relevant to our problem may actually help us unlock greater opportunity. And I'm going to shift here away from Gabon and bring in a new context. And this is around work we've done through the Bridge Collaborative to start to bring greater ties between the global humanitarian crisis relief sector and the environmental sector. Those sectors have not worked together much in the past for good reason, but the changing context, which I'll explain, is bringing them together much more than ever before. So just a bit of context here. Globally, we have historic levels of forced displacement, the most number of people ever in the history of our planet. 70.8 million people are displaced worldwide. It is one person every 2 seconds that is displaced anew. And what's even more striking than the numbers is the length. Whereas it used to be from months to a couple years, it is now a situation where people are being displaced for 10 or even 20 or more years. It is not a short-term situation. It is a long-term development problem that it happens in a crisis situation. For this part of the story, I want to go to Bangladesh, to a place called Cox's Bazar, where they have some of the largest refugee camps in the world, supporting the Rohingya Muslim refugees. There's been an influx in the last couple of years, and now there are over 900,000 refugees in this area. To put that in perspective, that's around 6 times or so the size of the city of Fort Collins, and not arriving in a planned or structured way, but in a crisis situation. Huge needs for basic needs of food, water, energy, and shelter. And again, the recognition that this is not a short-term thing needing to be addressed, but a long-term displacement. There is no time in sight that these refugees are going to be going back to Myanmar, where they're coming from. This is leading to really strong mounting pressures on the environment, which is integral to supporting these communities, these refugees, and the host communities that they're coming into. Water pollution and depletion is becoming rampant in the area. The Asian elephant corridor, a rare species, actually and tragically goes right through one of the camps. In the past couple of years, 11 people have died from human-wildlife conflict, a tragic situation. And I'll say more on the next slide about growing problems with deforestation and natural disasters in these camps. Fuel wood is the main source of energy that host communities and the refugees use. And the pressure of this massive influx is just devastating the local forests. The amount of energy needed is just far more than these forests can produce. There's a growing wave of deforestation happening, and that is causing conflict between the hosts and the refugees. It is also leading to situations of increased risk of landslides, erosion into waterways that provide water for these communities, and a lot of risks to life and to property. There is also, in this area, it's very prone to natural disasters. And last year, a major cyclone hit this area. You can see a photo here of some of the devastating impacts. And this is an area where disasters do hit, but this is particularly devastating in a context like the refugee camps, where people are already living on the edge. So into this situation, we had a chance to start to ask this question: can better linkages between the humanitarian and environmental efforts in this area actually create a better way forward for both groups? Forest restoration is a big need in this area, and the lead organization on the ground, called BRAC, a big development agency that's doing amazing work in this area, brought our team in to try and understand what is the state of knowledge around forest restoration, and how do we harness that to help make some progress for the humanitarian effort in this region where things are quite problematic. We brought in our team and several forest restoration experts. The team is shown here in this photo. I was not able to go to this work, but it's really amazing to hear the stories that were brought back and how powerful an experience this was for them, and how unique they found it to apply their restoration knowledge in the context of a humanitarian crisis, as something they had never done before. Through time in the field and time in meetings rooms, and really push themselves to think about what could help, and an actor on the ground ready to take these recommendations and do something with them, a bunch of recommendations were shared. They're the ones shown here, around building local capacity, trying to increase employment, which is desperately needed. An interesting one around shifting away from some of the non-native tree species in the area to ones that are native, which will be more resilient, actually which won't fall down and hurt people in the cyclones. Some other things here as well, but what's really striking about this experience for all of us is that the knowledge that was shared in this context is not new knowledge in any way. It's stuff that's well understood in the restoration community. It's applied in many cases. But the line of communication to the humanitarian process wasn't happening. And so this knowledge that could be useful wasn't actually being used in a useful way. And the humanitarian sector is working in very difficult situations. Major plans are made in weeks to months' time, and the environmental knowledge is often not there at the right time and in the right place. And in a small way, we did a test in a small, humble way to try and figure out, can we open that pipeline better? So this is just the start of a collaboration. We don't know where this will go, but we're excited about this idea of trying to take knowledge that is on the shelf already and find new ways that it can be used more effectively going forward. So I'll wrap this section and offer two questions for reflection. Directly coming on the Bangladesh experience, are we thinking broadly enough about which groups and sectors are integral to solving the problems we're facing? Sometimes they may be well outside of who we think we should be collaborating with, and that can be really good. I don't think of humanitarian organizations as who I should partner with in conservation. My mental model is definitely changing going forward. Second, I think in the collaboratives we're already in, I think sometimes we can be in tension with groups, and that can be hard. And other times we need to step back and rethink how we show up, how we engage more constructively, and show up and hold that tension in a more productive way to move the work forward. So as I move to wrap my talk, I want to come back to Lily Tomlin's quote, that we're all in this together, but by ourselves. And I think the hard work that's happening here in the Poudre, in Gabon, in Bangladesh, many other places, it's really starting to shift that narrative. Shift it in a way that shows that we hopefully can be in conversation together, and that we can hopefully achieve more towards the futures that we want. And I've talked, from my perspective, about three ingredients, by no means comprehensive, that can help in these kinds of efforts. Aligning around a shared problem that makes sense and is grounded in the evidence, thinking about what that North Star looks like for success, and being willing to redefine your comfort zone, to bring in, quote, strange or potentially unexpected partners to help advance our work. The work I've shared today is the work of many, many people, not just myself. So I want to end by appreciating the many folks who have contributed to this work. It's a pleasure to work with them, and I really appreciate the opportunity to have been able to speak today. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Questions for Josh? Microphones are running around. I want to learn about the surfing hippos.
The Luongo National Park, you can get there.
If you can get there.
It's not hard.
Then we got a question right here. Raise your hand. Stretch. She's got you.
My question has to do with thinking outside the box, and which made me think, well, it's not something that would address Gabon or Bangladesh, but it relates to them as well. I'm in the healthcare industry, and it's the concern with the river, the fish, and all the pharmaceuticals, the hormones, the estradiol, the statins, what was the other? I'm not sure. But anyway, there's many, many, many pharmaceuticals that are in and that we're using, that we're consuming, but they don't consume them, I'm sure, in other parts of the world. Okay, so maybe it's a thought to think, do we really need some of these things? Maybe there's other alternatives. Maybe that's a way to look outside the box.
I mean, I appreciate the reflection, and I'll just share a quick reflection back. I think, we are always learning about what's happening with things we use and the ways we interact, between nature and people. I think what we want to do is keep in mind, not just the single use that something is often designed for, but what the broader effects are of those things. So it's a soft answer, but I think one that can maybe help as we think about it. What is the direct reason we're using something, and how do we pick the best things to use, the way to design those from start to finish, what's often called a cradle-to-cradle design, so that things aren't harmful when they're thrown away, and they can be used and come back into production cycles in healthy ways. So I would say, though, I think many of the things we're seeing here with emerging contaminants or things we're not quite sure about yet are actually being seen in many other places in the world. And so there is a lot that's happening to understand what's going on in different places.
I'm worried about those two tables. I keep bringing up birth control. Other questions? It's Mary Lou, your pet influence. Up front here.
So I thought the account you gave of the Rohingya refugees was really interesting in that it was a cool example of synergy between the needs of the human population there as well as environmental restoration. These are things that are often put in contrast to each other. And I was just wondering if you could offer insight into perhaps how we could carry this ethic forward into other areas, other situations, sort of more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, I think the connections we see between people and nature are as strong and present in a crisis situation like Cox's Bazar as they are for each of us here today or many other places on the spectrum of lived experience. And so I think it's not an easy question to answer, but I think that the ways we start to see these connections, I think, is by really, in part, being in the field, where lives are not neatly bucketed into its energy or its environment or its fish or wildlife or its agriculture or so on. But in our day-to-day lives, we wear many hats and we go through many experiences. And for me, sometimes insights come from sort of reading papers and thinking globally. I actually do most of my work globally these days, but the insights really come from being embedded in places and really thinking hard about what that experience is and seeing the world from other people's perspective, and sharing yours with them. So I think there's a lot that can be learned from these types of approaches, and that can help fuel some of the efforts to better highlight the linkages between people and nature going forward.
Great job. Thank you, Josh.